The Making of Raiders of the Lost Ark came out in 1981, meaning it's one of the first making-of books ever published to coincide with the release of a movie. It's also a strong contender for the worst making-of book ever written. The author, Derek Taylor, shadowed the Raiders production while it was all taking place to create a sort of fly-on-the-wall in-the-trenches diary of the making of the movie. That is an awesome concept I wish more behind-the-scenes books used. Unfortunately, the way it manifests here is the most despicable, insufferable, self-indulgent, pointless drivel you could ever have the misfortune of reading. For a book called The Making of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, the amount of content it contains about the making of Raiders of the Lost Ark could fit on a brochure. Instead, what we have is some dull twat describing how he pottered around and twiddled his thumbs. Meanwhile, around him, off camera, or rather off page, one of the greatest movies of all time is being made, and he just doesn't really seem to care. He just wants to describe his own experiences and musings, his small talk with the cast and crew. In fact, he'll describe pretty much anything except the making of this movie. I'm not exaggerating this. It is really weird how determined he seems not to write about the making of the movie. I'll give a great example. This is an exchange in the book between him and Steven Spielberg where they're on set in Tunisia. Derek asks him, "How are things, life, working out for you?" Steven replies, "On this movie or life generally?" And Derek says, "Generally." That, to me, is the perfect capturing of why this book is so awful and why the author is incompetent beyond reason. The whole purpose of him being there is to write a book about the making of this movie, and when the director, in the midst of making it, asks him whether he wants to talk about this movie specifically or life in general, he chooses general. How? How can someone be so negligent of their duty and clueless as to what people want to read about? That example came from the beginning of a chapter that's sort of a Q&A with Steven, and the previous chapter was the same thing with George Lucas. And not once in those two chapters is Raiders discussed. It's all about their careers in general, the film industry in general, and this is the same with everyone he interviews. Pages and pages, 99% of which are just asking about them, about their jobs in general. That's what makes up the majority of this book. Not only is the content insufferable, but also his style of writing, which is just far too literary. It's just that sort of annoying literary journalism style that comes across as flowery and pompous. This book really is insane, just baffling as to how someone could have the balls, or more likely the lack of brains, to write a book like this, to be so apparently clueless as to how embarrassing this boring, navel-gazing failure of a book is. For the sake of having something positive to say, I'll point out the two things that are potentially nice, and I say potentially because even they are more failure than success. Firstly, the 32-page image section. The black and white reproduction quality and poor layout of the photos mean they're not particularly enjoyable, but not one of them is a still from the movie. They're all behind-the-scenes photos, a couple I personally don't recall seeing elsewhere, and I would have assumed such a photo section would have been packed with stills just trying to promote the excitement of the movie. That isn't the case really surprised and impressed me, considering how even today most behind-the-scenes books rely too heavily on filling space with stills from the movie instead of behind-the-scenes pictures or art. The other thing is, occasionally, very occasionally, Derek does paint a good picture and capture the reality of a moment in time on the production, but even so, nowhere near enough to have to suffer the majority of the book. The only very specific type of person who still may be interested in this book is the Indiana Jones, Lucasfilm obsessive or scholar. Even such a person will think this book is a heinous pile of garbage, but picking through that garbage, you will be able to find a few nice details. And for those moments which actually show some evidence of that fly-on-the-wall reporting the book should have been. That does offer a pretty unique perspective and experience you won't find anywhere else. Some things like the filmmaker's travel, accommodations, whose office is where in the production office, these sort of administrative things and downtime aren't the most exciting or important aspects of making a movie, but I think they're interesting in terms of showing the logistics and reality and human aspect of making a movie. But if that sort of stuff represents a highlight of your book, then you've still got a big problem. So So, for 99.99% of Indiana Jones fans, I'm sure by now you've realized you don't even want to think about wasting your time on this book. All you should be interested in is the complete making of Indiana Jones by Jonathan Rinzler. You can see my review on that book, which contains a huge and brilliant section on the making of Raiders. Plus, most of the very few good parts Derek does record in this book, Rinzler has taken and put into his book anyway. I think this also highlights what an incompetent piece of shit Derek Taylor is, that he had the opportunity that no other writer had or ever will have to be there at the time witnessing this movie come to life before his very eyes and talk to the people involved as they are in the thick of the creation, and yet he just pisses it away to bore us with his own thoughts and experiences and having people talk about filmmaking in general, as if any other author couldn't do that at any other time, as if that's what people are buying this book to read about. Compare that to Jonathan Rinzler, who, in writing his book 25 years after the fact, primarily has to rely on whatever sources happen to exist, and yet he runs laps around this douchebag who has every advantage over him. That shows the difference in power of a book by a writer who does their job properly versus one who doesn't, and produces something like this book, which is really just a disdainful, embarrassing joke. And so it's really not surprising at all that not only were there no follow-up books for the making of Temple of Doom: The Last Crusade, but that there were very few making of books published at all for the next 10 to 15 years, when you have a forerunner like this demonstrating nothing more than a waste of paper.